Hello, everybody. I'm Charlotte Jones-Carroll. I chair the board of UUSJ. It's a transformed board. Just a year and a half ago, we moved from being a regional board to a national, almost international board. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, and partly because we've known each other for over 40 years. David and I met in the process of preparing a World Bank project in Ecuador, the Guayaquil Urban Development Project, which was focused on providing and improving the living conditions and social services for the low-income parts of that coastal city. A number of years later, the idea that we development professionals at the bank should center the voices of impacted people rather than parachute in with our supposedly expert ideas emerged. And that simple concept, which for me was only a vague intuition, David turned into a plan of action. He helped start a participatory development learning group, which over a few years helped embed in the bank policies a change in the way bank professionals, World Bank professionals, approach their country counterparts. I would love to take the time to tell you all sorts of ways that made a big difference, but I want to go on and hear David. David and I were also part of a small multi-faith group within the World Bank called the Friday Morning Breakfast Group that met weekly. We shared ideas about more spiritual and humanistic matters. This was kind of like a, David can correct me, but semi-subversive initiative in the context of an institution that was normally led by engineers and hard economists. That Friday morning group might have been the first in the bank to discuss things like corruption and environment. This is why I've been a longtime admirer of David's skills at prioritizing vulnerable humans and listening to their voices. I was actually enthusiastic when he decided to accept the Bread for the World presidency in 1991, even though it meant losing a like-minded colleague. Now, let me summarize here what many of you have already probably read, but Reverend Dr. Beckmann's accomplishments. He is a Lutheran pastor as well as an economist. He's a family man, married with 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. He worked as a World Bank economist and, as I mentioned above, a sort of internal advocate for issues of hunger and poverty from 1976 to 1991. At that point, he left to become president of Bread for the World. And if you don't know Bread for the World, it's a key multi-denominational Christian nonprofit advocating to end hunger, both in the US and around the world. I think you served almost for 30 years there, David. So Bread for the World's mission is very similar to UUSJ's in the sense that we want to educate and equip people to advocate from the grassroots for policy change and for programs. In the case of Bread for the World, it's to end hunger. In the case of UUSJ, well, Pablo has listed some of our priorities: immigration, democracy, environment, and reducing poverty. After leaving Bread for the World, David continued his advocacy work. Of course, once you're an advocate, you can't give up. And I have to say, I had to learn to be an advocate because while working at USAID and the World Bank, I was hatched as an American. The Hatch Act kept me from advocating in the way I had to learn once I retired. But you continue to serve, as Pablo said, a coordinator and co-chair of Circle of Protection, which is an advocacy coalition of church bodies and agencies active in shaping and supporting President Biden's Build Back Better legislation. But here is one of the reasons we have him with us tonight. He's also begun to teach others about effective strategies for linking faith to political advocacy, which is, again, what UUSJ is trying to do. In his case, he continues consistency with reducing poverty and hunger. He does that at Virginia Theological Seminary, but he also does it in opportunities like this webinar. So I have to thank you. David, I will mention you were awarded the World Food Prize for your contributions to ending hunger, but I would give you any number of prizes for all that you've taught me over the years. So let me stop here and just let all the rest of you experience some of David's wisdom on work, which really is at the heart of what UUSJ also does. Take it away, David.
Well, thank you very much. I think that that may be the most gracious introduction I've ever received. Charlotte, really, we've been friends for a long time. And I really appreciate, Charlotte, your leadership of UUSJ. It's great to work, we keep working together in different ways. I also want to thank everybody who's on this call. You're all leaders, contributors, activists in pushing for social justice. You wouldn't be on the call if you weren't. So it's a real privilege for me to be able to meet with you tonight and share my thoughts, and then I look forward to the questions and answers, or I don't know, maybe objections and rebuttals. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I want to make 3 points. First, that advocacy in Washington is an effective way to push for social justice. Doesn't mean always in Washington. I love, like Charlotte noted in the chat, that you come from all over the country. That's the way you move Washington. Because the people gathered here do represent people from all over the country. The second thing I want to talk about is how important it is to engage the people who are directly affected by injustices in the advocacy, to hear their voices, to work with them. And then the third thought is I just like to talk a little bit about the election that we've just been through and how that may change the environment for advocacy over the coming year. I'm just delighted that UUSJ are putting new emphasis on advocacy at the federal level. My long experience has made me absolutely sure that changing US government policy is crucial, absolutely crucial to real progress on many social justice issues. And I'm also sure that it is possible for all of us working together to leverage really substantial changes in the world by speaking to our members of Congress and, in some case, the president and administration officials. Over and over again, I've seen small groups and individuals change the position of their member of Congress, even unlikely heroes, because we do live in a democracy, and members of Congress want to please their constituents. I think we've all seen that the faith community has been able to, over and over again, has taken on really big challenges, and not always got everything. We haven't always gotten everything we want, but even on these big issues, we've been able to help achieve major changes that are consistent with our values and our faith. I've really focused my whole career on hunger and poverty in our country and around the world. And so I'd like to start with my favorite graphic. So I'll share my screen. A seminarian here named Casey Jones helped me figure out how to do this. Okay. All right, how are we doing? Good. What this, you can see why I like this, because these are numbers on poverty over recent decades. They're on the international numbers are from World Bank absolute poverty data. And I think that long-term series of data may be the most robust way of measuring economic misery over the decades. And what it shows is just extraordinary. If you forget everything else that I say, remember the drop off, this cliff. In 1990, roughly 35% of the people in the world lived in absolute poverty. And by 2019, it was down to about 8% living in absolute poverty. I see this as obviously, it's just a huge liberation. And I see it as an exodus in our time, an experience of our loving God. It's certainly, no matter what you think about God, it is spiritually important that over these last decades, we have been through such a liberation. Now, there's still a lot of terrible problems in the world. I mean, right now, there's a group of countries where there's a concentration of the most severe hunger that we've seen for forever. People near famine. So, this macro picture doesn't show all the problems, but the macro picture is important. And then what I also find really striking is that that the pandemic has clearly been a big reversal, especially 2020. It probably jumped up to 10% of the populations of the world. 2021, the bank thinks it's gone back to 9% of the people in the world. That's still a hell of a lot of people. Still, I think this overall picture of progress against global poverty is tremendous reason for hope. And U.S. faith communities have had a role in this liberation. Really, if you go back to, say, the 1990s, foreign aid was really, really unpopular. No member of Congress wanted to defend it in daylight. If they were going to support it, they'd meet at night. It was just really unpopular. Bill Clinton got elected because he said George H.W. Bush was too internationalist, and so was Democrats and Republicans together, who were tough on international aid. But the faith communities have always been in favor of effective development and humanitarian assistance. Not all U.S. What the U.S. calls foreign aid, because there's a lot of security aid that serves U.S. purposes, but humanitarian and development aid, effective humanitarian development aid, we've always supported it. And then really starting in about 1999, right at the end of the Clinton administration, that was when the faith community won international debt relief for the poorest countries in Africa and other parts of the world, especially well-managed developing countries. And then from then on, what we've seen is a steady increase in U.S. poverty-focused development assistance. It's quadrupled in size between 1990 and 2019. And also the quality of foreign assistance has improved substantially. And we've had a lot of help from Bono and Bill Gates and Bush, George W. Bush, surprisingly, and also Barack Obama. And in the Trump administration, by that time, there were enough Republicans in Congress that we were able to maintain the level of poverty-focused development assistance through the Trump years. And then Biden has been an important advocate for it. So we've had a lot of help, but the faith community has been important over and over and over again over these decades, always an important leader in increasing and improving aid. And that hasn't been, there have been many reasons why we've seen this dramatic reduction in poverty. I think the most important one is that poor people around the world now know a lot about how to get out of poverty. They know about schools, they know about rural roads. They know what ought to happen. And like people everywhere, they are willing to do everything to get their kids a better life. So it's that drive among people in the world that I think is the main motor, maybe that and the purposes of Almighty God that have driven this great liberation. But there is no question that U.S. leadership on foreign aid, on poverty-focused development assistance, has contributed to this huge change for the better in the world. I was awarded the World Food Prize in recognition of the fact that the U.S. faith community had played a substantial role in reducing world hunger. Now, look at on the left side, you get the domestic poverty numbers. These are based on the Census Bureau's best measure of poverty. The first bar is 1967 because we made more progress. The most progress we've ever made against poverty was during the War on Poverty and the first couple of years of the Nixon administration. It was then that the country, on a bipartisan basis, just had the sense that we ought to do something about poverty in America. I think partly because of the race riots of the Black Power movement, all that. I think both parties knew we needed to do something. And so this goes back to 67 because so much of the progress was made then. But that period established the social welfare programs, and they've been under attack ever since. We're always on the defensive with them. But in fact, we've been able to maintain that level of funding pretty much and also improve the quality of those programs over the years. So it's important for us in the U.S. It gets discouraging, as we go through things, it can be really discouraging. And I think it's important to put it in perspective and remember that measured by poverty and some other indicators that we've made progress in this country. The part of this that I really want to focus on is what's happened during the pandemic, because it started during right at the very beginning of COVID. You remember 7 million people lost their jobs. There was there were people cars lined up at food banks, long lines at food banks all across the country. And we had every reason to expect that we would see a substantial and sustained surge in hunger and poverty. That's what happened after the financial crisis of 2008. So that's what I expected. But remarkably, even in the last year of the Trump administration, Republicans and Democrats worked together on major legislation, massive legislation, to keep the pandemic from collapsing our economy. And the Democrats negotiated big increases in unemployment assistance as part of that package. So we managed to stave off the increase in hunger and poverty that would have been expected. And then in 2021, this number is just unbelievable. Child poverty and hunger among families with children dropped to their lowest levels ever in the history of the United States. In the middle of the pandemic. We know that the pandemic has caused a lot of suffering. It still is causing suffering and dislocation. But by these important metrics of food security and poverty, 2021 was a banner year. Now, the ironic, horrible thing is that in December, all the Republicans and Senator Manchin voted against continuing key elements of the American Rescue Plan, which had done a lot of this good, notably the child tax credit. The expansion of the child tax credit drove much of the progress against poverty and hunger that we saw in 2021. And all that stopped at the end of the year. So child poverty's jumped back up about 25%. All is not lost, I should say, because my guess is that poverty and hunger are roughly at the levels of 2019 and 2020. But it kills me that we know that the child tax credit expansion did tremendous good for millions of kids. We know from studies of what happened that it did not depress employment. The adults in those households kept working. They used the money well for food and rent and those sorts of things. So there is just, I just can't understand how we can let that experience go by and not re-expand the child tax credit, at least for the poorest families. Okay. As the coordinator of the Circle of Protection, I've been, as Charlotte said, I've been working on these big money bills that affect poor people, and trying to help a wide array of church bodies and agencies like the National Council of Churches, the National Association of Evangelicals, the National Network of African American Clergy, work together on those bills. And I think we've had, the faith community has, I think it's very clear that we've had a very substantial impact. Going back to that last year of Trump, in focus, we managed to focus attention on the poverty relevant provisions, and then push, and with people from different faith communities working together, often people from all across the country speaking to their own members of Congress. That's the most important thing. We've clearly had an impact, and should take some satisfaction in the fact that poverty and hunger did not increase significantly during the pandemic in the United States, and that in 2021, millions of children had a remarkably good year. The second point I want to talk about is the importance of hearing from the people who are directly affected by social justice. UUSJ has really made that a major feature of your work. You bring it into the faith community in a very strong way, into your collaborative relationships with other groups. And it is really very important. I think it's possible, more possible than it used to be, there's a lot of new energy among low-income people in speaking for themselves. So it's not like I think some things have changed. Digital media, social media have in fact made people more informed, sometimes misinformed, but informed and engaged. We see that by the record participation in elections. Also, decades of faith-based organizing in about 200 communities across the country has trained a lot of low-income leaders to speak for themselves and push for change. So, and just there's nothing like it. If you're in a meeting with a member of Congress and somebody from the district is there or a couple people from the district are there who have lived poverty or living poverty, it changes the tone of the conversation. It's serious, and there are people who have real knowledge and passion. They can't be stopped. I also think it's a smart idea that you're partnering so strongly with the Poor People's Campaign. I was teaching at Union Seminary in New York last fall and got to know Liz Theoharis, and was just one of the co-conveners of the campaign. And I'm just really impressed by how savvy they are. The campaign, as you know, thinks in terms of poor and near poor people. It makes sense because people who are close to the poverty line often fall under the poverty line. You know, they have a car repair problem and then they're in poverty. they can't feed their kids, or, then they maybe climb out and then they're back down. So I think it's a smart strategy to focus on 100 million people who are poor or near poor, and help them to be strong in advocacy, savvy on the issues, networked, and they have a long-term vision. They don't expect to win, on all the issues right away, but they think over the decades ahead that if poor and near poor people get organized, they will push for fusion change, for environmental sustainability, more peaceful policies, more just policies. So I think it's a smart strategy, very much grounded in people who are suffering from poverty and related issues. And so I applaud you for that. I also it's important. I think I learned from the gay rights movement. My son is gay. One of my sons is gay, and he came out when he graduated from high school. I think in that first couple months, he convinced several hundred people who'd never really thought about the issue before to support gay rights, because they knew Andrew. So it was people at our church, people for his friends, our family. Everybody was for Andrew. And but I think that happening. What we need on poverty issues too, we need more poor people who are not ashamed to say, my family is really struggling, or we've needed food stamps, and people in the past were ashamed of that. But as people come out and speak for themselves on the poverty issue, I think that'll change our politics. Finally, I want to talk briefly about the election. The political environment for social justice is still tough, but not as tough as it was before these elections. It very much seems like the Reverend Senator Warnock in Georgia won today, and that'll contribute to an easier environment in the Senate. It won't all depend on Manchin anymore. The most important result of the election, of course, is that Democrats maintained their majority in the Senate. They kept the Republicans to something like a 5-vote majority in the House, and they also outdid the Republicans in state elections. It's really quite an accomplishment. And I think it's also very important that the extreme right just lost. Almost all the candidates that President Trump was really pushing were defeated. And I think all of the election deniers among candidates for governor and attorney general were defeated. I think that change within the Republican Party may do us as much good as the Democrats winning. Anyway, I think for the theists among us, the elections are cause to thank God. The close balance between Republicans and Democrats, I think, means that the next couple of years could be a very, very important time, fruitful time for advocacy, because every one of the moderate Republicans has the kind of leverage that Senator Manchin had last year. If you can get 5 or 10 Republicans to vote against the fiscal cliff, or vote against or vote for some creative poverty or social justice provisions, you win. So I think, but the advocacy groups are going to play. They have more room to play, more place where they can maybe influential than if one party or the other dominate. I want to ask you to do something this month, and that is to contact your 2 senators about expanding the child tax credit, especially for the poorest families. In my judgment, we're not going to get everything we want. If for it to pass, there has to be bipartisan legislation that can command the votes of 10 or 12 Republicans. And so there needs to be negotiation, but even in that, there are some Republicans who are really interested in the child tax credit. Republicans, in a way, invented the child tax credit years ago and have done good things on it. So there's possibility for a negotiation that would expand the child tax credit, especially for the poorest families. And that's what I'm asking for. Pablo has put an action alert in on the UUSJ website. And so I'd urge you to take a look at that and then just send a note or make a call to your two senators. You're all skilled at that. In conclusion, I want to talk about the 2024 election and just the importance of elections generally. I worked in a bipartisan way on advocacy for all those years, 28 years at Bread for the World. But since I retired from that, I've been more involved in election work, and I've learned how important it is. I have also learned that only 20% of Americans give any money to political candidates or parties. I just think, it leaves the field open for outsized influence by a relatively small number of mega donors, individuals and corporations. So I really encourage you to give time and money generously to USSJ. That's the point. That's the main point that I want to make. But also, I encourage you to give time and money to candidates and to parties and to voter mobilization. So that we, by 2024, that we've got a different kind of Congress in those chairs, and our advocacy can go forward more ambitiously. Thanks a lot.